Good evening, and welcome. I'm the Yawning Historian, and tonight, there is nothing you need to do and nowhere you need to be. So make yourself comfortable. Pull the blanket a little higher, let your head sink into the pillow, and let your eyes close whenever they feel ready. Tonight, we are going back more than 700 years to spend a single, quiet night inside a medieval castle. We will walk its cold corridors, sit by its dying fire, meet the men who guarded the sleeping city, wander into the strange, forgotten world of the two sleeps our ancestors knew, and follow the long, slow history of the bed itself. None of it requires anything from you. All you have to do is listen and drift. Our story begins in the autumn of the year 1280-something, on a road in the south of England. The light was fading, and the air smelled of wet leaves and wood smoke. A traveler, tired from many days of walking, came over a low hill and saw the castle for the first time. It stood on a rise above the river, a great mass of gray stone, its towers dark against the evening sky. Here and there, a narrow window glowed faintly orange, where a candle or a rushlight burned somewhere deep inside the walls. From a distance, it looked magnificent, solid, warm even. The traveler quickened his pace, imagining roaring fires, roasted meat, and a soft bed somewhere behind those walls. He was, as we will slowly discover tonight, mostly wrong. The first thing that struck every visitor to a medieval castle was not the grandeur. It was the smell, and then, almost immediately, the cold. Stone holds the chill of the night long into the day, and the chill of winter long into spring. Accounts from the time suggest that even in rooms with a fire burning, the corners of a great hall stayed cold enough that servants slept in their cloaks, and lords wrote letters complaining that the ink had thickened in the inkwell beside them. Our traveler crossed the wooden bridge over the ditch, passed beneath the gatehouse, and gave his name to the porter. The porter was an important man, more important than his simple room beside the gate would suggest. It was his job to know who came in and who went out, and to close the great oak doors when the light failed. Once those doors were barred for the night, they did not open again for anyone, not for merchants, not for messengers, not even, according to some accounts, for members of the household who had lingered too long in the village below. A castle at night was a sealed world, and everyone inside it settled into the same slow rhythm of darkness. Inside the courtyard, the day was winding down. A stable boy led the last of the horses to their stalls, murmuring to them in the half-light. A kitchen servant carried a basket of bread across the yard, and somewhere near the well, two guards talked quietly, their breath already showing in the cooling air. Above them, the sky moved slowly from gray to a deep, soft blue, and the first stars appeared over the eastern tower. The traveler was led into the great hall, and this was the heart of the castle, the one room that every account agrees was truly alive. It was long and high, with wooden beams overhead that disappeared into shadow, and rushes spread across the stone floor. At the far end, a fire burned in a hearth wide enough to stand in, and the light of it moved gently across the walls, across faded tapestries, across long tables where the household was gathering for the evening meal. Supper in a castle was earlier than you might imagine, usually well before what we would call dinner time, because everything in the medieval world followed the sun. Candles were expensive. Rushlights burned quickly. When the daylight went, the working day simply ended, and the entire household, from the lord down to the youngest kitchen boy, began drifting towards sleep not long after dark. The meal itself, on an ordinary evening, was quieter than the feasts we see in films. There was bread, usually coarse and dark for the servants, paler and softer at the high table. There was pottage, a thick soup of peas and beans, and whatever vegetables the season allowed, kept simmering day after day. There was ale, brewed weak enough that everyone drank it, because it kept better than water. On a good night, there might be salted fish or a little pork. The hall was warm near the fire, filled with the low murmur of tired voices, the clink of wooden bowls, the occasional laugh, and beneath it all, the steady crackle of burning logs. And then, gradually, the hall grew quiet. This is the part of castle life that surprises most people. There were very few bedrooms in a medieval castle. The lord and his lady had a private chamber, called the solar, up a winding stair behind the high table. A few honored guests might have small rooms of their own, but almost everyone else, the servants, the guards off duty, the clerks, the visiting messengers, slept right there in the great hall, on benches, on straw pallets, on the rushes themselves, wrapped in cloaks, arranged around the hearth like spokes around a wheel. So as the fire burned lower, the hall slowly transformed. Tables were pushed back against the walls. Straw mattresses appeared from corners. Men and women found their usual places, the older servants closest to the warmth, and settled down under wool blankets and heavy cloaks. Someone banked the fire, covering the glowing coals with ash so that they would survive until morning, and the light in the great room faded to a soft, deep red. The traveler lay down on a pallet a little way from the hearth, listening. A castle at night was never completely silent. The fire ticked and settled. The wind pressed against the shutters, which were wooden, because glass was a luxury even kings used sparingly. Somewhere above, a door closed. A dog, one of the several that lived in the hall, circled twice and lay down with a long sigh against a sleeping groom. Out on the walls, faintly, the footsteps of the night watch passed overhead, slow and regular, back and forth beneath the stars. He pulled his cloak up to his chin, felt the warmth of the banked fire on one side and the vast cold of the stone room on the other, and thought that it was not the bed he had imagined on the road. But it was dry, and it was safe, and the sounds around him, the breathing of 40 sleeping people, the fire, the wind, the watchman's steady tread, folded together into something almost like a lullaby. While the hall sank into sleep, one room in the castle stayed awake a little longer. Up the winding stair, behind a heavy curtain, the lord's chamber, the solar, held the last candlelight of the night. The solar was the only truly private room most castles possessed, and by our standards it was still not very private at all. The lord and lady shared it with a servant or two sleeping on a truckle bed, a low wooden frame on wheels that slid beneath the great bed during the day. Accounts suggest that a lady's maid often slept within arm's reach of her mistress, and a lord's chamberlain within call, because in a world without electric light, without locks as we know them, and without alarm bells, the human beings around you were the alarm system. The great bed itself was the most valuable piece of furniture in the entire castle, and we will have much more to say about beds later tonight. For now, it is enough to picture it, a wooden frame as large as a small room, hung with woolen curtains that closed on every side. When the curtains were drawn, the bed became a warm, dark box within the cold stone chamber, a room inside a room. The lady's maid banked the chamber fire, blew out the candles one by one, and the last light in the castle, save the porter's lantern and the watchman's brazier, went out. Now the castle belonged to the night, and the night had its own staff. On the walls, wrapped in the thickest cloaks they owned, the night watch walked their slow circuits. Being a watchman was, by every account that survives, one of the most boring jobs in the medieval world, and the men who did it would be quietly pleased to know that centuries later, the very idea of their work would be putting people to sleep. They walked from tower to tower, counting their steps, watching the dark countryside for the orange bloom of a distant fire, listening for hoofbeats on the road. Mostly, there was nothing. Mostly, there was the river below, murmuring against the stones, and the wind moving through the woods beyond the fields, and the enormous, star-filled silence of a world without engines. To pass the hours, the watch had small rituals. They met at the corner towers and exchanged a few words in low voices. They warmed their hands at a small iron brazier kept burning in the gatehouse. They marked time by the great candle burning in the guardroom, a candle with rings painted around it, each ring roughly an hour of slow melting, or by the stars swinging gradually around the fixed point of the North Star. When the church bell in the village below rang for the midnight office, the watch changed. Cold men came down the narrow stairs toward warmth and sleep, and warm men climbed up, sighing, into the cold. Inside the hall, the traveler half woke when the watch changed, as sleepers in castles must have done every night of their lives. He heard boots on stone, the soft clank of a belt buckle, a murmured word at the door. The fire was a dull red glow beneath its blanket of ash. A dog lifted its head, decided the sounds were familiar, and went back to sleep. The traveler lay for a while in the warm darkness, listening to the castle breathe. If he had risen and wandered, quietly, the way we are wandering now, he would have found the castle full of small, half-secret night lives. In the kitchen, a low vaulted room smelling of smoke and yeast, the embers of the great cooking fire were carefully preserved under ash, because starting a fire from nothing with flint and steel on a cold morning was slow, miserable work, and the cook guarded those embers the way a treasurer guards silver. A kitchen boy slept on a bench near the warmth, and a cat moved silently along the shelves, doing the castle's most ancient night work, keeping the mice from the flour. In the stables across the yard, the horses dozed standing up, shifting their weight from time to time, and the stable boy slept in the loft above them, in the sweet, dusty warmth of the hay, which was, though no one would have admitted it, one of the most comfortable sleeping places in the entire castle. In the chapel, a single small flame floated in a red glass before the altar, the only light in the castle that was never allowed to go out. And down in the cellars, among the barrels of ale and the sacks of grain, the cold deepened, and the darkness was absolute, and nothing moved at all except, very occasionally, the castle's oldest and least official residents, the mice, going about their small, urgent errands in the dark. The hours of the deep night passed slowly, the way they always pass, whether or not anyone is awake to count them. The candle in the guardroom melted down through its painted rings, one ring, then another. The stars wheeled slowly over the towers. The river went on murmuring. Somewhere out in the dark fields, a fox called once and was quiet. On the walls, the watchman walked and stopped and leaned on the cold stone and walked again, and one of them, in a low voice, hummed a tune his mother had hummed, a tune that was already old when the castle was built. And in the great hall, in the warm red darkness, 40 people slept, packed close as puppies, under wool and fur and travel-stained cloaks. A servant turned over and murmured a name. The old hound by the hearth ran somewhere in a dream, paws twitching. The banked fire settled, very softly, sending up a small breath of sparks that glowed and floated and went dark one by one. Toward the end of the night, the cold reached its deepest point, the hour when, as the saying went, the night is oldest. The watchman on the east wall pulled his cloak tighter and watched the sky beyond the hills change, so slowly that it could barely be called change at all, from black to a black that was slightly less than black to the faintest possible gray. A blackbird, somewhere in the orchard below the walls, tried a single note and thought better of it. The watchman yawned, a long, enormous, jaw-cracking yawn, the yawn of a man who has earned his bed, and rang the small bell that told the kitchen the night was ending. And that is where we will leave the castle, right at the hinge of the night, with the fire being coaxed back to life from its embers, and the first pale light touching the tops of the towers, and everyone who slept in the great hall still deep in their last and sweetest hour of sleep. The traveler did not wake. He had walked a long way, and the hall was warm, and no one in the castle was in any hurry, and neither are we. Let the castle fade now, stone by stone, into the gray morning mist. Our night is still young, and there is more slow history waiting for us. Take a breath, let it out gently, and drift with me down the hill, along the river, toward the sleeping streets of the medieval city, where a bell is ringing softly, and the watchmen of the town are just beginning their rounds. Our second story tonight is about the men whose whole job was the night itself. We are leaving the castle behind and walking, slowly, with no particular hurry, into a medieval city. Picture London, sometime in the 1300s, on an ordinary autumn evening, as the light drains out of the sky and the whole city begins, street by street, to shut itself down for the night. The end of the medieval day did not arrive gradually, the way our evenings do, with lamps and screens and headlights carrying daytime deep into the dark. It arrived officially, announced by a bell. As the sun went down, the bells of the city churches rang what was called the curfew. The word itself is a small piece of history. It comes from the old French phrase couvre-feu, which means, simply, cover the fire. When the curfew bell rang, every household in the city was expected to bank its fire, covering the burning wood with ash, or with a heavy clay lid made for exactly this purpose, so that the flames could not leap up in the night and do what fire did so terribly well in cities built almost entirely of timber and thatch. It is worth pausing on this for a moment, in our slow and unhurried way, because it explains almost everything about the medieval night. These were cities of wood. The houses leaned toward each other over narrow streets, close enough in places that neighbors on upper floors could reach out and touch hands across the gap. Roofs were thatched with straw or reed. Floors were strewn with rushes. Workshops were stacked with timber, cloth, tallow, and hay. A single untended candle, a single spark climbing out of an open hearth on a windy night, could take a street before midnight and a whole quarter of the city before dawn. Everyone knew this. Everyone had heard the stories. And so the covering of fires at nightfall was not a suggestion. It was the law, and it was a law that people mostly, sensibly, obeyed. So the curfew bell rang, from one parish church, then another, the sound overlapping and echoing down the darkening streets. And beneath that sound, the city performed its nightly ritual of closing. Shopkeepers folded down the wooden shutters that had served all day as display counters and barred them from inside. Apprentices carried tools indoors. Housewives called children in from the streets. The gates of the city, the great gates in the wall, through which all the traffic of the kingdom had rumbled since dawn, were swung shut and barred with beams as thick as a man's waist. The drawbridges, where there were drawbridges, came up, and the city, which moments before had been an open place, connected to every road in England, became a sealed box of perhaps 40,000 sleeping souls. Accounts suggest that the process was noisy, brief, and remarkably fast. Within an hour of the curfew bell, the The streets that had roared all day with carts and hooves and hawkers were empty, dark, and quiet. Not modern quiet, which is never really quiet at all, but a deep, layered, living silence, in which you could hear a dog bark 3 streets away, and the river against the bridge piers, and the wind working at loose shutters. And, if you listen long enough, the small sounds of 40,000 people settling, coughing, murmuring, and beginning to snore behind their walls. But a city, even a sleeping one, cannot be left entirely alone in the dark. And so, as the ordinary citizens barred their doors, a different set of men buckled on cloaks and picked up lanterns and staves and stepped out into the empty streets. These were the watch. The night watch of a medieval city was not a police force in any modern sense. It was, in most towns, a rotating duty, a chore that fell upon ordinary householders the way jury duty falls on us. Each ward of the city, each neighborhood, was required to provide a certain number of able men to walk its streets from curfew until dawn. In practice, the wealthier sort often paid substitutes to take their turn, and so the actual walking was frequently done by the same familiar handful of men, older men, patient men, men who did not mind the cold as much as they claimed, and who had long ago made their peace with the fact that their job consisted, almost entirely, of nothing. Let us follow 2 of them now, as they set out from the small guardhouse by the ward boundary. An older man we might call Walter, who has done this for 20 years, and a younger one, half asleep already, carrying the lantern. The lantern is a wooden and horn box with a candle inside, horn being scraped thin enough to glow, since glass is dear, and it casts a light that we would find almost comically small, a warm, wobbling circle perhaps 3 paces wide. Beyond that circle, the city is dark in a way that no modern city is ever dark. There are no street lamps. There are no lit windows, or almost none, because light means candles and candles cost money. There is the sky, which on a clear night blazes with stars straight down into the chimney tops. And there is the lantern, and that is all. Walter and his companion walk their ward slowly, because there is no reason to walk it quickly, and because they will be walking it back and forth until dawn. Their duties, as the city's regulations describe them, are wonderfully unhurried. They are to see that fires are covered, watching the chimneys and the cracks of shutters for any treacherous flicker of open flame. They are to challenge anyone found abroad after curfew, calling out to ask who they are and what their business is. They are to listen, and they are to walk. That is the whole job. Watch, challenge, listen, walk. Being out after curfew, without good reason, was an offense. The records of the city courts are full of people described as night walkers, a word that has since wandered off into other meanings, but which then meant simply someone found in the streets at an hour when honest folk were in bed. If Walter's lantern found you in the dark, you would be asked your name and your errand, and your answer mattered. Some people had every right to be out. Midwives, hurrying through the dark to a birth, were always allowed to pass, and it was understood that they might be abroad at any hour. Physicians and priests, called to a deathbed, passed freely. Servants sent to fetch a doctor. Men of good reputation coming home late from a guild feast, provided they carried a light and answered civilly. The carrying of a light was important. A man walking with a lantern was announcing himself to the whole street, hiding nothing. A man slipping along in the dark, keeping to the walls, was another matter entirely, and might expect to spend the rest of the night in the ward lockup, waiting to explain himself to the alderman in the morning. And yet, for all the regulations, the medieval night was never quite empty. As Walter walked his rounds, he passed, and knew he passed, a whole hidden population of legitimate night workers. The bakers were the great ones. Bread was the fuel of the medieval world, and bread eaten at breakfast must be baked in the night. So behind their shuttered fronts, the bakeries glowed and thumped softly until morning, and the smell of them, warm and enormous in the cold air, was the one great comfort of the watchman's route. Walter, like every watchman in history, had an understanding with a certain baker on his round, and there was often a small loaf, too misshapen to sell, waiting on a windowsill for the watch, and the baker in turn slept a little easier knowing the watch passed his ovens 12 times a night. There were others, the brewers, whose fires needed tending at strange hours, and who were tolerated so long as those fires stayed within their hearths. The carters who brought fresh fish up from the coast in the small hours, so that it could be sold at dawn, their wheels rumbling hugely down the empty streets. And, it must be said, in the alleys and around the edges of the law, the city's less respectable night people, the dice players in back rooms, the drinkers who had failed to leave the tavern when the tavern officially closed, and who now sat in the dark behind its shutters, drinking quietly and listening for the watch. Tavern keepers were forbidden to serve after curfew, and the court records make it clear, in entry after patient entry, that this law was broken in every ward of the city, every single night, for hundreds of years. Walter knew which doors had late drinkers. Unless they grew loud, he generally chose, in the great tradition of night watchmen everywhere, not to know. The hours passed. This is the part of the watchman's night that no record can quite capture, and that we, lying warm in the dark, are perhaps best placed of anyone to understand. The city clocks, where there were clocks, struck the hours far apart. Between them stretched enormous plains of uncounted time, in which nothing happened, and continued to happen, slowly. Walter and his companion walked, and stood, and leaned in a doorway out of the wind. They spoke, in low voices, about nothing in particular, the price of candles, a daughter's marriage, whether the weather would turn. Long silences lay between the sentences, and neither man hurried to fill them. They listened to the river. They watched the stars turn over the rooftops, the only clock that never needed winding. Somewhere a baby cried briefly and was hushed. Somewhere a dog, and then another dog traded a few remarks and thought better of it. The lantern candle burned down and was replaced and burned down again. Once, in the deep middle of the night, a shutter creaked open above them and a woman's voice, low and worried, asked whether they had seen her husband, who had gone out at sunset and not come home. They had not, but Walter knew the man and knew which tavern shutters he was probably behind, and said, in the diplomatic language of a 20-year watchman, that the fellow was likely helping a friend with a task and would be home before the bells. The shutter closed, somewhat comforted. An hour later they passed the husband himself, navigating homeward by touch along a wall, and Walter held the lantern for him at his own doorstep and said nothing, and the man let himself in with the elaborate silence of the guilty, and that was that. The watch had many duties, and one of the oldest and least official was mercy. Toward the end of the night, the cold sharpened, the way it always does just before it breaks. The stars in the east began to thin, and the city, which had seemed so profoundly asleep, began, here and there, to stir. The baker's boys came out with the first trays. A well rope creaked. The fish carts rumbled toward the market square, and the first church bell, far away across the rooftops, rang for the morning office, one small bell, answered after a while by another. Walter and his companion finished their last round in the gray half-light, seeing the streets take shape around them, the familiar corners returning one by one out of the dark, like a room remembered on waking. At the guardhouse, they handed in the lantern, its candle finally allowed to gutter out, and Walter, 20 years a watchman, did what he did every single morning of his watching life. He went home through the waking streets, ate the misshapen loaf, still faintly warm, that had been waiting on the baker's windowsill, drank a cup of small ale, lay down on his own bed as the whole city around him got noisily up, and fell instantly, blissfully asleep. And we will leave him there, sleeping like a man who has earned it, with the morning light growing gently on his ceiling and the sounds of the day beginning outside his shutters, sounds that no longer concern him at all. The night has been walked and watched, and it passed, as almost every night in history has passed, without incident. Let the city fade now, street by street, into the morning. Breathe out, slowly, and let your thoughts wander where they like, because our next story asks nothing of you except that you stay exactly as comfortable as you are. We are going to visit the strangest and most forgotten country of the medieval night, the country of the two sleeps, the quiet hour in the middle of the dark when, all across the old world, people used to wake up on purpose and were not troubled at all. Here is a small and comfortable piece of history that most people have never been told. For most of the human past, in most of the places we know anything about, people did not sleep the night through in one long block, the way we are taught to believe we should. They slept twice, and the record they left behind of this habit is so ordinary, so unremarkable to the people who wrote it down, that for centuries nobody even noticed it was there. Let us settle in, because this story is really the story of an ordinary night, told slowly, and it belongs to almost everyone who ever lived before the electric light. Picture a farmhouse, somewhere in the English countryside, in the 1600s. It is a house of 2 rooms and a loft, timber-framed, with a great hearth in the main room and small windows shuttered against the dark. The family, a farmer, his wife, 3 children, an elderly grandmother, and a servant boy who helps with the animals, ate their supper as the light failed, a supper of bread, cheese, pottage, and a little bacon, and then, with the fire banked and a single rushlight burning, they did not linger long. Candles, as we have said before tonight, and as everyone in this house knew in their bones, cost money. Darkness was free. When the rushlight burned down, the household went to bed, all of them, at an hour we would consider absurdly early, perhaps 8 or 9 o'clock, and the house folded itself into the dark. And then, some hours later, in the deep middle of the night, perhaps around midnight or a little after, the house woke up. Not suddenly, not to an alarm. It simply surfaced, gently, the way a sleeper drifts up from a dream, and found itself awake, and was not surprised. This was the watch, or the watching, the quiet interval between what people called the first sleep and the second sleep. The terms appear all over the old records, in English, in French, in Italian, in Latin, mentioned casually, the way we might mention lunchtime, as a fixture of life so universal that it needed no explanation. A court record notes that a witness heard something after his first sleep. A doctor advises taking a remedy after the first sleep. A traveler writes that he composed his thoughts between his 2 sleeps. Nobody ever stops to explain what a first sleep is, because everybody knew. The historian who finally noticed this pattern, reading thousands of these documents a few decades ago, was a scholar named Roger Kirch. And what he pieced together, reference by reference, was a whole lost country of the night. The first sleep began soon after dark and lasted 3 or 4 hours. Then came the waking, an hour or more of quiet, drowsy consciousness in the middle of the night. And then the second sleep, another 3 or 4 hours, carrying the sleeper through to dawn. 2 sleeps, with a soft valley of waking in between, night after night, across whole centuries. So let us spend that middle hour with our farmhouse family, because what people did with it is the loveliest part of the story. The farmer's wife lay for a while in the enormous dark, listening. The fire was a faint red breathing under its ash. The wind moved around the chimney. Beside her, her husband stirred and woke too, and they lay in the warmth talking quietly, in the unhurried, half-dreaming way of people who are awake in the middle of the night and know they have nowhere to be. Accounts suggest this was the hour when husbands and wives truly talked, the day's work being done and the morning's work not yet begun, an island of conversation in an ocean of labor. The old books, with their usual frankness, also recommend this hour for married affection, and at least one 16th century physician argued solemnly that it was the best hour for it, the body being rested and the mind at ease. History does not record what the farmer and his wife thought of the physician's opinion, and we will leave them their privacy. In the other room, the grandmother was awake too. She had lived with the 2 sleeps for 70 years and moved through the night hour with the ease of long practice. She sat up in bed, wrapped in a shawl, and prayed, murmuring the old prayers into the dark, unhurried, half aloud. The church had long ago made a home in this hour. The night offices of the monasteries, the prayers said at midnight and before dawn, fitted the 2 sleeps like a key fits a lock, and prayer books were full of devotions written specially for the waking between sleeps. Quiet prayers, trusting prayers, prayers designed to be murmured while the house creaked and the embers ticked, and the whole world lay somewhere between one dream and the next. The servant boy, in the loft, woke and lay on his back in the hay-smelling dark, listening to the mice conduct their affairs under the eaves, and thought about nothing at all, in the way that boys can, magnificently, for an hour at a time. Sometimes, on other nights, he would creep down to the banked fire and sit with his feet near the warmth, dozing. Poorer households, the records suggest, used the hour for small silent tasks that needed no good light, mending a strap, carding a little wool, shelling beans saved from the evening, tending the fire, checking a sick animal. There are accounts of neighbors visiting each other in the watching hour in the villages, of people stepping outside to look at the weather and the stars, of the night having, in effect, its own small social world, lit by embers and moonlight, conducted in low voices, and gone without a trace by morning. And then, gradually, one by one, the household drifted down again. The talking trailed off into longer and longer pauses. The grandmother finished her prayers and lay back. The boy in the loft turned over into the hay. The second sleep took them, the deep, sweet, dreaming sleep of the second half of the night. The sleep the old books say was the softest, and the house sank back under the surface of the dark and did not rise again until the birds began. Now, you might reasonably wonder, in a drowsy sort of way, whether this was simply a story people told, a custom of a few places, a habit of the pious. And this is where the story takes its most satisfying turn. Some years ago, sleep scientists ran an experiment. They took a group of ordinary modern people and, for a month, gave them nights the length of a medieval winter night, 14 hours of darkness, no electric light, nothing to do after dusk. And within a few weeks, without being told anything about history, without any suggestion at all, the sleepers settled, one by one, into the old pattern. They slept for a stretch, woke quietly for an hour or two in the middle of the night, lay in calm, unworried wakefulness, and then slept deeply again until morning. The 2 sleeps had been waiting inside them all along. Inside us, the pattern was never lost. It was only papered over, quite recently, by the brilliance of our evenings. Because what ended the two sleeps was not a decision. It was light. Cheap, plentiful, artificial light. Gas lamps in the streets, then electric light everywhere, pushing bedtime later and later, squeezing the night from both ends until it was too short to hold two sleeps, until the middle waking was crushed out of it, and forgotten so completely that when people woke at 2 in the morning, as their ancestors had done contentedly every night for thousands of years, they now lay in the dark, believing something was wrong with them. And that, perhaps, is the gentlest thing this old story has to offer, and a good thought to hold as you drift. If you wake tonight, in the small hours, you are not broken and nothing is wrong. You are simply, briefly, back in the oldest country of the night, the quiet valley between the first sleep and the second, where your great-great-grandmothers said their prayers, and farmers talked softly with their wives, and boys listened to mice in the dark, and nobody ever once looked at a clock. You can lie there as they did, warm and unhurried, knowing that the second sleep always comes, that it is on its way to you even now, rising slowly like warmth from a banked fire. So let the farmhouse fade, with its embers and its murmurs and its 14 hours of winter dark. Let the whole lost hour fade with it. Gently, no need to hold on to any of it. Our last story of the night is waiting, and it is the softest of them all, the long, slow, creaking, feather-stuffed history of the thing you are lying on right now. Sink a little deeper into it, wherever you are, because we are about to find out how it got there, and how long it took, and why, for most of history, the bed was the most precious thing a family owned. And so we arrive, by the most natural route imaginable, at the bed itself. You are lying on the end result of about 10,000 years of extremely slow improvement, and almost nobody ever stops to wonder how it happened. It is one of the great quiet inventions, worked out gradually, generation by generation, by people who left no names behind, only comfort. So let us take the long way through it, from a pile of leaves to the thing beneath you now, at exactly the pace such a history deserves, which is to say, no pace at all. Begin at the very beginning, further back than we usually go. The oldest sleeping places archaeologists have found are not beds as we would recognize them, but they are unmistakably beds in spirit. In a cave in southern Africa, researchers uncovered layer upon layer of ancient bedding, compacted sheets of grasses and soft rushes, laid down again and again in the same spot over tens of thousands of years. And in some of those layers, they found something wonderful. The sleepers had spread their bedding over a base of ash and mixed in aromatic leaves from plants that are natural insect repellents. Ash to keep the crawling things from climbing in, fragrant leaves to keep the biting things away, soft grass on top for comfort. Which is to say, the very first bed we know of already had a mattress, a bug-proof base layer, and a nice smell. People have been taking sleep seriously for as long as there have been people. Move forward, slowly, through the millennia, and the bed begins, in some places, to climb up off the ground. This was the first great leap in bed technology, and it happened for reasons that had nothing to do with luxury. The ground is cold, and the ground is damp, and the ground is where the insects, the mice, and the drafts conduct their business. Lift the sleeper even a hand's width into the air, and the night becomes warmer and drier, and considerably less sociable. The Egyptians, by the time of the pharaohs, had elegant wooden bed frames, some of them gently sloped, with a footboard to stop the sleeper sliding, and instead of a pillow, a curved wooden headrest, which looks alarmingly uncomfortable to us, but which kept elaborate hairstyles intact through the night in a hot climate, and which some people in various parts of the world still swear by today. The Romans, who put engineering into everything, put it into sleeping as well. A prosperous Roman had several beds for different purposes: a bed for sleeping, a couch for dining, a couch for reading, and the best of them stood on bronze frames with woven leather straps supporting a mattress stuffed with wool, or, for the truly wealthy, feathers. It is with the Romans that we first hear, again and again, the great recurring theme of bed history, which is that the mattress is only as good as what is inside it, and what is inside it announces exactly who you are. Straw for the poor, wool for the comfortable, feathers for the rich. Hold on to that idea, because it will run beneath the next 1,500 years like a warm current. Now let the empire fade, and come north and forward, into the medieval world we have been wandering all night. And here we must correct, gently and drowsily, one of the small injustices of history, because the medieval bed has a terrible reputation, and it is only partly deserved. It is true that the poorest slept much as their ancestors had, on straw pallets, on benches, on the rushes of the hall floor, as we saw in the castle in our first story. A pallet was a simple sack, a great flat bag of coarse cloth stuffed with straw, or with heather, or with dried bracken, laid down at night and stood against the wall by day. If the straw was fresh and deep and dry, it was honestly not bad, springy, warm, sweet-smelling. If it was old, it was a different story, flattened, dusty, and inhabited. And one of the small recurring pleasures of the medieval year, mentioned in household accounts, was the refilling of the bed sacks after harvest, when everyone in the house, for a few weeks at least, slept on clean new straw, and the whole house smelled faintly of a summer field. But the medieval bed, the real, proper, aspirational bed, was another matter entirely, and it was magnificent. In an age when most furniture amounted to a table, some benches, and a chest, the bed was the piece of furniture, the single most valuable object in almost every household that owned one. Wills and inventories, those patient lists of everything a person left behind, tell the story with perfect clarity. Beds are listed first, described lovingly, item by item: the frame, the cords, the feather bed, the bolster, the pillows, the sheets, the coverlets, the hangings, and they are left, by name, to specific beloved people. The best bed in the house was a treasure passed between generations, and the second best bed, left in a will, was not an insult but a substantial gift, a fact worth remembering when people chuckle about a certain playwright from Stratford leaving his wife exactly that. Consider what a great bed actually was, layer by layer, because the layers are the whole pleasure of it. At the bottom, a stout timber frame, often oak, pegged together, sometimes carved. Across the frame ran a lattice of ropes, threaded through holes in the rails and pulled taut, and these ropes were the springs of the pre-industrial world. Ropes stretch and sag with use, and so beside many beds hung a wooden tool for tightening them, twisting the lattice back up to firmness. And it is from this nightly and weekly ritual, so the traditional story goes, that we inherited the phrase "sleep tight." On the ropes went a mat or a canvas, then the mattresses, plural, because a proper bed wore several, a firm base stuffed with straw or wool, and above it the glory of the whole arrangement, the feather bed, a deep, soft, billowing sack of down, shaken and plumped each morning, into which the sleeper sank as into a warm snowdrift. Accounts suggest a good feather bed could take the feathers of dozens of geese, gathered over years, and a household built its feather beds the way it built its savings, gradually, with patience, plucking by plucking. Then the linens, coarse for every day, fine for guests, the bolster, that long firm pillow spanning the bed's whole width, the pillows propped against it, because medieval and early modern people, interestingly, often slept far more upright than we do, half-sitting, banked up on pillows, a position the physicians of the day earnestly recommended. And over it all, the blankets, the quilts, and the coverlet, the decorated top layer, the face the bed showed the world. And around it all, the curtains. The great bed stood within its own hangings, heavy wool or, in grand houses, embroidered cloth, hung from a frame or from the ceiling. And at night the curtains were drawn shut on every side, and the bed became what it had been slowly becoming for centuries, a room within the room, a soft, dark, enclosed box of warmth in the middle of a cold stone or drafty timber world. Inside the curtains, the air warmed with the sleeper's own breath. The draft stopped. The light died away to nothing. It was, in every sense that matters to a sleeping animal, a den, and the fact that we now know a curtained four-poster mostly as a museum piece or an extravagance in a honeymoon hotel says more about central heating than it does about comfort. The bed being so valuable, people naturally shared it. And this is the part of the old sleeping world that surprises us most. Sharing a bed, for most of history, carried no particular meaning beyond warmth and economy. Whole families slept in the one good bed. Servants shared beds with other servants, apprentices with apprentices, and travelers at an inn shared beds with total strangers. As a matter of course, the price of a bed at an inn being, quite often, the price of a place in a bed. Diaries of the period record bed sharing with the same emotional weight we would give to sharing a train compartment, noting only whether the stranger snored, or hogged the blankets, or came in late. There are letters in which one man complains, at gentle length, that his bedfellow of the previous night talked politics until an unreasonable hour. The night, like the day, was simply more crowded then, and people were used to sleeping in company, lulled rather than disturbed by the breathing of others. The greatest and most famous bed of the age took this sociability to its logical extreme. In an inn in the town of Ware, north of London, there stood a bed so large that it became a national landmark, the Great Bed of Ware, an enormous carved oak four-poster, roughly 10 feet by 11, reputed to sleep at least 4 couples, and mentioned by name in plays of the period, including by Shakespeare, as a byword for anything absurdly oversized. Travelers went out of their way to spend a night in it, and then went home and told everyone they had, and carved their initials into its posts, and pressed their seals into its wood, which is to say that the Great Bed of Ware was not only a bed, but very possibly history's first piece of tourist accommodation with its own guest book. It still exists, by the way. It sits, vast and dark and patient, in a museum in London, having outlasted every single one of the people who ever slept, giggled, snored, or complained about the blankets in it. From there, the bed's history runs gently downhill toward us, becoming steadily softer and quieter as it goes. The 18th century brought better metal and beds of iron, which had one enormous, unglamorous advantage over oak. Insects found nowhere in them to live, and generations of housekeepers blessed them for it. The 19th brought the coiled steel spring, borrowed, of all places, from the seats of carriages, and the mattress learned to push back politely against the sleeper for the first time. The 20th brought cotton batting and foam, and, eventually, machines that could weave and stuff and quilt a mattress with almost no human hands at all, and the bed, which had once been a family's treasure, listed first in the will and left by name to the eldest child, became something ordinary, something everyone simply had, which is, if you think about it in the right frame of mind, one of the kindest things that has ever happened, quietly, to the human race. And here you are at the end of it, lying on the sum of all of that patience. Beneath you, in spirit, are the ash and sweet leaves of the cave, the rope lattice waiting to be tightened, the straw smelling of the harvest, the goose down gathered plucking by plucking, the drawn curtains, the shared warmth, the 10,000 years of people lying down at the end of the day and trying, with whatever they had, to make the night a little softer. Every one of them would envy where you are right now. It is warm, and it is clean, and it is yours alone, and it holds you the way the featherbed held the Lord, and the hay held the stable boy, and the fresh straw held the farmer's children after harvest. So settle into it, one more degree deeper, and let the whole long history of comfort do its slow work. There is just one more place to visit tonight, the quietest place in the entire medieval world, a place where even the night itself was organized, hour by gentle hour, and where silence was not an absence but a craft, practiced and perfected for 1,000 years. We are going, very slowly, to spend the small hours in a monastery, and after that, I promise, we will let the night have you. For our last story, we are going to the quietest place in the medieval world. Not the quietest by accident, the way a forest or an empty moor is quiet, but the quietest on purpose, a place where silence was built, maintained, scheduled, and perfected, the way other institutions perfected stonework or brewing. We are going to spend the small hours of the night in a monastery. And if the rest of tonight's stories have been about how people slept, this one is about a group of people who organized the night itself, and in doing so, accidentally became the timekeepers of the entire Western world. Picture an abbey in the countryside, in the 1200s. On the same autumn night, we have been drifting through all evening. It sits in a river valley, a great pale church with a square tower, and around it, arranged like the rooms of a single enormous house, the cloister, the dormitory, the refectory where the monks eat, the chapter house where they meet, the infirmary, the kitchens, the barns, the fish ponds, the orchard, the beehives, the wall around everything, and the fields beyond. Perhaps 40 monks live here, along with the lay brothers who work the land, and the whole establishment runs on a schedule so precise, so ancient, and so unhurried that kings envied it without ever quite managing to copy it. The monastic day was divided not by clocks, at first, but by prayer. 8 times in every 24 hours, the community gathered in the church to sing the offices, the fixed services of psalms and prayers that the rule of Saint Benedict, written 700 years before our visit and still in use, laid out for every hour of the day and night. The names of these services ring like a slow bell through the whole of medieval history. Matins, in the deep night. Lauds at first light. Prime, terce, sext, none, through the working day. Vespers, as the light failed. And Compline, the last office, as darkness settled in. It is Compline that begins the night, so let us begin there too. The monks file into the church in the dusk, in their dark habits, and sing the day to a close. The Psalms of Compline are the gentlest in the whole cycle, full of protection and rest and shelter under wings. Chosen 15 centuries ago by people who understood exactly what a human being wants to hear before sleeping in the dark. The last prayers ask, in words repeated every single night for over 1,000 years, for a quiet night and a perfect end. And then the abbot sprinkles the monks with holy water as they pass, one by one, out of the church, and the Great Silence begins. The Great Silence was the monastery's masterpiece. From Compline until after the first office of the morning, no one spoke. Not the abbot, not the cook, not the youngest novice. Necessary communication happened, when it absolutely had to, through an elaborate vocabulary of hand signs that monasteries developed for the purpose, signs for bread, for water, for book, for candle, and the sign lists that survive make wonderful, drowsy reading, because they are inventories of everything a quiet life contains. But mostly, nothing needed saying. Everyone knew where to go and what came next, because everything had been done exactly the same way, at exactly the same hour, for longer than anyone could remember. Silence, in a monastery, was not emptiness. It was the sound of a system working perfectly. The monks climbed the night stair, a staircase leading directly from the church into the dormitory, so that sleeping and praying were joined by 30 steps of worn stone. The dormitory was one long room under the roof beams, with a low partition or a simple curtain between beds, and the beds themselves were plain almost to the point of comedy after the feather beds of our last story, a straw mattress, a pillow, a woolen blanket, sometimes a mat of rushes underneath. The rule instructed that the monks sleep clothed, in their habits, with their belts on, so that they would be ready to rise for the night office without delay, and that a candle burn in the dormitory all night, and that the younger monks not have beds side by side, but be spaced between their elders, an arrangement that every teacher who has ever supervised a school trip will immediately understand. By the time full darkness lay on the valley, the whole abbey was asleep. And here the monastery joins all the other sleeping places we have visited tonight, the castle hall, the watchman's city, the farmhouse, because the monks, too, slept their first sleep. The whole rhythm of the monastic night was built on the two sleeps we learned about earlier, formalized and sanctified. The first sleep began soon after Compline, and then, in the deep middle of the night, at an hour between midnight and 2, depending on the season and the house, a single monk, the one entrusted with the office of waking, rose, lit his lantern from the dormitory candle, and rang the bell. Think for a moment about that monk, because his was one of the strangest and most necessary jobs of the medieval world. Before mechanical clocks, someone had to know when to ring the midnight office on cloudy nights, in the dead of winter, with no stars visible and no moon. Monasteries solved this with water clocks, with marked candles, with the position of the stars when the stars could be seen, and above all with the practiced instinct of men who had woken at the same hour for 40 years. The sources record the anxiety of it, instructions about what to do if the waker overslept, penances for ringing the office late. And it was precisely this problem, the problem of waking monks reliably in the dark, that drove much of the early development of the mechanical clock. The first great clocks of Europe were built for towers like the one above our abbey, and they were built, fundamentally, as alarm clocks for prayer. Our whole ticking, scheduled, punctual world descends, in a quiet way, from the need of monasteries to sing psalms at 2 in the morning. It is one of history's better jokes that the people who invented the alarm clock were the people least troubled by waking. The bell rang, softly, in the darkness, and the monks rose, without a word, in the small pool of lantern light, straightened their habits, and filed down the night stair into the church for matins, the great night office. The church at that hour was vast and almost entirely dark, A few candles at the choir stalls making islands of gold in an ocean of black stone. The windows faintly less dark than the walls, the roof invisible, somewhere far above. The monks stood in their carved wooden stalls, facing each other across the choir, and began to sing. Matins was long, the longest office of all, an hour and more of psalms sung antiphonally, which means one side of the choir sang a verse, and then the other side answered, back and forth, wave after slow wave, all in plain chant, that ancient, floorless, unhurried music that does not build or rush toward anything, but simply continues, rising a little, settling, rising, settling, like breathing made audible. The voices moved together through the psalms and the candlelight. 30 or 40 men singing quietly in the middle of the night in an empty stone building in a dark valley, as their predecessors had done on that spot every single night for 200 years and would do for 300 more. No audience, no occasion, night after night after night. The same words at the same hour, sung whether it snowed or stormed, whether the king was at war or the harvest had failed, an unbroken thread of quiet voices running through the entire medieval millennium, stitching the nights together. If you had stood at the back of the church, wrapped in a borrowed cloak, you would have heard the chant blur pleasantly at the edges, because, and the sources are honest about this, the monks were half asleep. Of course they were. The medieval church knew all about drowsiness at matins, legislated for it, joked about it, and built tolerances around it. And this is one of the most human and endearing corners of the whole monastic record. The carved wooden seats in the choir stalls folded up, and on the underside of each was a small ledge, called a misericord, from the Latin for mercy. And the mercy in question was this, that an old monk could fold his seat, lean back against the little ledge, and take most of his weight off his feet while still, technically, standing. Monastery customaries, the books of house rules, discuss what to do about brothers who nod off, and the traditional remedy was gentleness itself. A designated monk walked slowly along the stalls with a lantern, and when he found a sleeper, he did not shake him or scold him. He simply held the light near the man's closed eyes until the glow woke him, and then moved on. In some houses he carried the lantern in one hand and, the sources suggest, was expected to be an elderly and forgiving man himself. After matins, in many houses and many seasons, came an interval, and here the monastic night shows its deep kinship with the farmhouse we visited earlier, because this was the monk's version of the watching hour between the two sleeps. Some returned up the night stair to bed, to sleep again until dawn. Some stayed, reading by candlelight in the cloister carols, or praying alone in the dark church. The customaries of different orders argued for centuries, in their patient way, about exactly how this middle of the night should be spent, more sleep or more reading, and the arguments themselves, preserved in manuscript, are among the most detailed records we have of how seriously the old world took the architecture of the night. And then, as the east grayed, the bell rang again for lauds, the office of first light, and the abbey turned its face toward morning. The great silence held until after prime, so the first hours of the monastic day passed still without speech. The fires lit in silence, the animals fed in silence, bread set to rise in silence broken only by the sounds work itself makes. In winter, between offices, the monks were permitted one great luxury, a visit to the warming house, the single room apart from the kitchen and infirmary where a fire was kept burning, and they stood around it in their dark habits, hands out to the heat, not speaking, in what must surely be one of the most peaceful scenes the Middle Ages ever produced, a room full of silent men, warming their hands at a fire they had all been looking forward to since matins, listening to the wood crackle, entirely content. We could stay here much longer, The monastery rewards slow attention the way few places do. The herb garden with its patient rows, the fish ponds lying still under the morning mist, the scriptorium where, later in the day, monks would bend over parchment and copy, letter by letter, the books through which almost everything the ancient world wrote reached us at all. But the night is what we came for, and the night is nearly over, there and, perhaps, where you are. So take just one more image with you. It is the deep middle of the night in the Abbey Church. Matins is done. One old monk has stayed behind, alone in the choir, a single candle beside him. He is not reading. He is not even, particularly, praying. He is sitting on his folded seat, leaning on the mercy of the misericord, hands folded into his sleeves for warmth, looking at the small gold flame in front of the great soft darkness, listening to the buildings settle and the wind move around the tower, in a silence he has kept so long it fits him like his habit. He is completely unhurried. He has nowhere to be until the bell rings, and when it rings, he will know what to do. And until then, there is nothing at all, that needs to happen. Borrow his quiet, if you like. You have earned it, simply by lying still and listening this long. Let the abbey fade now, the candle, the choir stalls, the worn night stare, the whole patient valley. Let it all sink gently back into the dark it came from, 700 years deep, where it is always the middle of the night, and the silence is always kept, and the second sleep is always just about to begin. And now, before we let the night have you completely, let us go back, one last time, to where we began. Do you remember the castle? It feels like a long time ago now, and in the way that matters tonight, it was. The traveler on the road, the gray towers above the river, the porter at the gate, the great hall with its banked fire. We left them all sleeping, hours ago, in the oldest part of the night. Let us drift back over the dark fields and see the night out with them. Nothing has changed, and that is the point of the whole place. The river still murmurs against the stones below the wall. The watch still passes, slow and regular, along the battlements, though the men have changed twice since we left, cold men going down to warmth, warm men climbing up into the cold, the oldest shift change in the world. The banked fire in the great hall still breathes its faint red breath under the ash, exactly as the curfew bell instructed, and around it, in the warm darkness, 40 people are deep in their second sleep now, the soft one, the sweet one, the one the old books praised, and the hall is full of the slow tide of their breathing. The traveler is among them, far under, dreaming of nothing he will remember. His cloak has slipped, and one of the hall dogs has arranged itself against his back, an arrangement satisfactory to everyone concerned. In the solar, behind the drawn curtains of the great bed, the lord and lady sleep in their warm wooden box within the cold stone room, and on the truckle bed beside them, the maid sleeps too, all three of them held by ropes that were tightened just last week, and by feathers gathered by plucking over 20 patient years. In the kitchen, the embers wait under their ash for morning, guarded even in sleep by the dreaming cook. The cat has finished its rounds and folded itself into a perfect circle on the warm hearthstone, the one creature in the castle that has understood the night completely and has nothing more to learn from it. Out in the stables, the horses stand dozing shoulder to shoulder, and the stable boy is buried so deep in the sweet hay of the loft that only one arm shows. And in the chapel, the small red flame floats steadily in its glass, the one light in all the castle that never sleeps, keeping its silent watch over all the others. Beyond the walls, the valley lies under the last and deepest hour of the dark. The village at the foot of the hill is a cluster of sleeping roofs, each one covering its banked fire, its shared beds, its families stacked warm and close like loaves. Somewhere down there, a farmhouse has finished its watching hour, the prayers said, the quiet words spoken, the second sleep begun. Far off, on the edge of hearing, the abbey bell rings for the night office, a small silver sound carried on the wind across the dark fields. And in the choir the monks are rising in their pool of candlelight to sing the hours forward, as they do every night, so that no one else has to. The whole medieval world, castle and city, farmhouse and abbey, is doing the same thing at the same time, in the same darkness. It is doing what you are doing. It is sleeping. And this, in the end, is the small, warm truth we have been circling all night, through the cold corridors and the watchman's rounds, the two sleeps and the feather beds and the great silence. Every person in every one of tonight's stories, the Lord in his curtained bed and the boy in the hay, Walter the watchman and the baker at his ovens, the farmer's wife and the old monk leaning on his misericord, every single one of them ended every day of their lives exactly the way you are ending this one. Tired and warm as they could manage, and lying down in the dark, waiting for sleep to come and take the weight of things away for a while. The centuries between you and them are real, but at this hour, they are thin, thinner than a blanket. The night you are lying in is the same night they lay in. It has simply been handed down. So let it hold you now, the way it held them. The fire is banked. The doors are barred. The watch is walking somewhere so that you don't have to. The bells will ring the hours forward without any help from you. And the second sleep is rising toward you now, slow and certain, like warmth from embers. There is nothing left to listen for. There is nothing left to do. The castle is asleep. The city is asleep. The whole long-ago world is asleep, and you are welcome to join it. Thank you for spending the night in history with me. I'm the Yawning Historian.